begin with, I want to take a look back at John because it's been a long while since we've done an In Search. And the first one we did, we talked about the book of signs and the book of glory. So chapters 11 and 12 in John are kind of a segue or kind of a transition from the book of signs to the book of glory. So what I told you before was the book of signs is John 1 through 12. And then the book of glory is John 13 through 21. The book of signs, we've talked about that word signs, right? That point to something. Jesus' miracles are signs pointing to who he is, pointing to the fact that he is the Messiah. And so chapters 1 through 12 are a bunch of stories about what Jesus said, what he did, miracles. He only records 7 miracles, but he's very picky about which ones he records. But he shows himself to be, even without the miracles, right? He shows himself with Nicodemus, with the man at the woman at the well, with the woman caught in adultery. He shows us who he is over and over and over again in conversations with the Jewish leadership. And so the book of signs are the chapters that point to who Jesus is, that he is Messiah. The book of glory is the story of his death and resurrection, where Jesus is glorified. Now listen, we'll talk about this again, but the cross was the most ignominious, the most shameful kind of death you could have. It was reserved for the lowest of the low. And what John is going to tell us is that on that cross, on that ignominious cross, he was glorified. And obviously, when he was raised, he was glorified as well. So at this point, we are still in the book of signs. But at the same time, chapters 11 and 12 are kind of transitional chapters in John. So I'm going to give you John 1 through 10 in a nutshell really quickly, and then we'll get going with Lazarus. So John 1 through 10 began with the prologue, which you know now 13 verses of, and you'll know almost all of it. Probably all of it through 18. And it moved from there into an explanation of John the Baptist and his ministry. And from there we read stories, dialogues, miracles, discourses that are centered around the institutions of the festivals of Judaism. Have you noticed how much time in John that Jesus spends in Jerusalem at a feast, right? And now he's at this feast, and now he's at this feast. And there's not a lot in between. We don't see him in Galilee as much. And when we do see him in Galilee, it's not generally for a long story. The wedding at Cana would be one. But it's saying that he went around in Cana and now he's back in Jerusalem. So we see this series of dialogues and stories and things that are telling us who Jesus is. So, for example, Jesus declares himself to be the living water and the light of the world during the Feast of Tabernacles. And that was a Jewish festival, if you remember, that centered on the symbolism of water and life and light. If you go to 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, you're going to see light and life everywhere. When you go to John, in the Gospel of John, you're going to see light and life everywhere. Those are two really important words in all of John's writings. And so during that festival, he gives light to a blind man. He gives sight to a blind man, giving him light so he can see. And all of it is a sign of who he is. Everything he says and everything he does is pointing to who he is, that he is the Christ. He is the Messiah. He is God. And so then John 10 closes with an inclusio. An inclusio is kind of a final statement that sums something up. It's just a fancy word for that. So here's is that what I want? Again, they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained, and many came to him, and they said, John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true, and many believed in him there. Where do we first see Jesus in his public ministry? Not the wedding at Cana, after that. He's with John. He's baptized, right? And then he calls his disciples, and that's the beginning of his public ministry. And obviously, in a sense, his death is the end of that ministry. Now that ministry continues on, and it will for eternity. But this is, kind of wrapping up what Jesus did in those first 10 chapters. So Lazarus' resurrection is the last of Jesus' signs and the greatest of Jesus' signs. But at the same time, John 11 and 12 are also looking forward to the book of glory. So it's kind of wrapping up the book of signs, but it's also pointing to the book of glory. Because Lazarus' resurrection is looking forward to who else's resurrection? Jesus's, right? It's kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus's own resurrection. In fact, in John 12, we're going to see the story that John mentions in John 11, which is kind of weird, right? That Mary was the one who anointed Jesus' feet with an ointment and wiped it with her hair. Remember, he mentions that in John 11. And we're going to read about that in John 12. Now, what? By the time John wrote this, it would have been a well-known story. So he's talking to his first readers saying, she's the one. It happened after Lazarus, but John's gospel came out after all of that. And so his readers would have gone, oh yeah, that Mary, because there are a lot of Marys in there. So, okay, yeah, that Mary. So Lazarus' resurrection is looking forward to Jesus' resurrection, and the anointing at Bethany that Mary did to Jesus, and the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday, which is the next thing, are both tied to the death and resurrection of Jesus. Obviously, when he comes in on Palm Sunday, he's coming into Jerusalem for the last time. But at the anointing, when Judas says, this should have been sold and the money given to the poor, Jesus' answer is in the AKB, she's supposed to do this because she's anointing me for my burial. So there's that foreshadowing of what, and I'm sure his disciples were like, what? Because they really didn't get it. So we have in these two chapters, chapters 11 and 12, a transition from the book of signs to the book of glory. Now, as we go through this story, I want you to look for something. And I'm going to have to explain, well, maybe I'm not. I think you'll figure it out. We all, you guys are smart. Listen. This chapter is all about Christology. What's Christology? The study of Jesus, right? Yeah, that's what ology means, right? So this story is all about Christology, about who he is, or having an understanding of Christ. So it's the study or understanding of who Christ was and is. And this chapter shows us a lot about who Jesus is. And we also see we also see John's passionate desire that his readers would come to know who Jesus is, and know that Jesus is the Christ. That's who he is. Once again, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's why he wrote everything in here, including the story of Lazarus. By the way, at the end there, where it says that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, a more literal rendering of those words would be that the Christ is Jesus. But it means basically the same thing. So John is also all about Christology. John 11 is also all about Christology. It may seem like this is a story of Lazarus, but truly it is not. He was just lying there. He did nothing. He died, and his body was lying there. But it's a story about Jesus and who he is and the power he has even over death. Only God has that kind of power. So Lazarus and his death are just vehicles through which this truth can be conveyed. So now let's get to the background. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. So let's look a little bit at Bethany, and we've done this already. But you see, here is Jerusalem, and Bethany's not far away. Bethlehem, by the way, is over here. Bethany is not far away. It is in walking distance, and or a couple of miles off. So it is within walking distance, especially at that time when people pretty much walked everywhere. And actually, John's going to make that point that it's close to Jerusalem at the end of our story. And then we see Mary and Martha are sort of introduced to us in this passage. And so he talks about, so he says, Mary, who was the one who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. And as I already told you, that anointing story will be told in chapter 12. Yes. The story of, so let's talk about Mary and Martha a little bit. You remember the story about Mary and Martha in Luke 10 where they're throwing a party, right? And what's Mary doing? She's sitting at the feet of Jesus. What's Martha doing?
Trying to clean
everything else. This is why I believe Martha was the firstborn. She goes to Jesus and says, tell my sister to help me. I mean, see what I'm doing here? I'm doing all the work. Come on, give me some help. And Jesus says, actually, what Mary's doing is more important. And I love what Jesus says. He says, Martha, Martha, you are concerned about, you are fretting about things that don't matter. You should be sitting at my feet too, basically, is what he says. I wish I had time to tell the story of when God spoke those words into my ear, maybe some other day. So I think Martha was likely the oldest. Maybe Lazarus was older, but certainly the oldest daughter, older than Mary. She's probably the baby of the family. And it's clear, both in the narrative and in the action of the story, that Jesus loved these people. They were close friends, and they were dear to him. Now, does Mary ask, or do the sisters ask for anything in this? Flat out? But it's implied. You're exactly right. They don't actually ask, but the implication is clear what they want. Come heal him. They never say that. Please come heal him. Will you come heal him? But they knew Jesus would assume that's what they meant. And Jesus interprets it that way. Jesus understands what they're saying. And so this is what he says. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. So first of all, he says, this illness will not end in death. Obviously, Lazarus will die. But death will not have the final word. Not for this immediate death of Lazarus, and not ultimately when Lazarus physically dies again. Not ultimately when any believer dies. Death never gets the final say in a Christian's life. Yes.
I think that I've never seen it changed in translation, where it says it will not end in death.
Yeah.
That happens, but that's not the end.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. Yeah. It doesn't end with death for anyone. So then he says, this is for God's glory. Now, when he says that, it's not so much that he's saying that God may be praised, although that's good, that's fine. But I think what he's saying, rather, is that this tragedy has happened so that God may reveal his glory. The purpose of the death and the purpose of the resurrection is to reveal God's glory through Christ. And more specifically, that God may reveal his glory through his Son. So it is, in fact, another sign that Jesus is Messiah, and it is the last and most dramatic of his signs, miracles. Now, we see with that word so, it tells us that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And then it says so. So that word so means that the delay was motivated by love. The delay was motivated by love. More literally, it says when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Because Jesus loved the family of Bethany, he waited to respond. How does that make sense? That's not what we would do, any of us. Well, here's the thing. Jesus knows what's about to happen and what he's about to do. And he knows that it will be a powerful encouragement to the faith of this family, as well as to his disciples who were with him. It was in their best interest that he waited. And that's what love does. Love does what is best for the other. Love is never selfish. Look at 1 Corinthians 13, you will see that. Love is never selfish. Which means, ladies, especially, I suppose it can happen to gentlemen, but more often than this, if any boy ever says the words, if you love me, I don't care what comes after that, you'll love him. He doesn't love you. He's not preferring your best over his own. Same is true for you guys. It doesn't put you over them, over themselves. They don't love you. That's what love is. Love is selfless, not selfish. So it was for in their best interest that he. So he then returns to Judea. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." So this is a metaphor about daylight, and the disciples would have been frightened, obviously, to return to Judea, where they're just a couple miles off from where the Jews were so recently wanting to kill him. So it would be like, I don't know, my house is probably about 2 miles from here. And if your mortal enemy was a 5-minute drive away, you'd probably be like, close, right? And so they were afraid about that. And the opposition to Jesus was rising, and had been even in December. And this is sometime between December and April-ish. So March, April-ish. So that was a very long time. So Jesus here is reassuring his disciples, and he's reiterating that he is the light of the world. And he gives two applications. Jesus and the disciples, he says, must do the work of God while it is still light, meaning while he is still here, before night falls at Golgotha. And he plans, and this is a really good apologetic for you 2 years from now. And I will tell you this many times: senioritis is a fictitious disease, and so many seniors get toward the end and they're like, "I'm out." Jesus didn't do that. He's like, "Come on, we got to keep going before night falls, before it ends. We have to keep working." And so, and then on a related note, the disciples, so long as they are with the light of the world, must walk in his light. Because after his death, and then after his resurrection, he won't be there to guide them. But he is there to guide them through this trip to Judea. I think, nope, let's do one more little bit if we can. If the bell rings, then we'll stop. So verses 11 through 16. After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken them." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us go that we may die with him." So, there's some irony and misunderstanding in here. Don't wake him up. Don't wake him up. I mean, he let him sleep. When my dad would come home, especially after he'd been flying for a few days, he'd go upstairs where my sister and I were. This was in Wary, that no longer exists on Offutt. And my mom would be like, my mom had been with two little kids all day, right? And she's like, no, don't wake him up. Don't wake him up. And he'd go up and he'd come down with one of us in his arms. And he'd say, "He was already awake." Now, I think he kind of went, he just kind of touched us to woke us up. But that's what the disciples are saying. No, let him sleep. He needs the sleep. But I can just hear Jesus deadpanning. I don't mean to wake him up from his sleep. Okay, we'll pick up here.
Thank you.